Good morning and welcome to Grace. October 1991 was a year where a fishing boat named the Andrea Gale had set sail from a New England port to fish. They were fishing specifically for swordfish. And on their return in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, they had actually faced this hurricane that was named Grace. Waves that measured up to 10 stories high and winds that were up to 120 miles per hour had hit their boat. And meteorologists called this hurricane Grace the perfect storm. Now, not knowing their decision when they first traveled that they were going to be in this situation, this hurricane ended up costing them their lives. Many times in our lives, unbeknown to us, without any warning, a storm comes along, and like this sad Andrea Gale, we don't choose it. We don't make that decision to endure the storm. We just find ourselves in it. So, a storm can easily take our lives. And the passage that we're in this morning, as we continue our expository journey through the Gospel of Mark, gives us a perfect example of what we are to do with our lives when we have to endure the storm. Most believers today, actually, I think they have an easier time to profess trust in Jesus and his power, and especially over the storms of our life. But many of us, even as Christians, seem to fall short of demonstrating that trust when that storm arrives. And so saying that we believe Jesus and we believe that Jesus can help us takes on a whole new meaning when we actually depend on our lives for him to help us. We all will face storms in our lives, and no one goes through life without storms. So in our passage this morning, in Mark chapter 4, Mark has just described the intense encounters between Jesus and the various groups in the previous chapters, the religious leaders, the crowds, and even his own family. And then chapter 4 starts with this series of, you could call them teaching stories, these parables. And so this morning we get into a new section where Mark starts to record a series of miracles that demonstrated Jesus' power over not only just the natural elements, but he gets into the spiritual realm and even the human body as we get on to chapter 5 and beyond. So Mark presents this proof for Jesus and his startling and divine nature as we read this morning. So in our passage, Mark moves from this collection of parables back to another collection of Jesus' miracles, but these miracles are a little different than the first set of miracles that were recorded. So let's go ahead and read this together, starting at verse 35 and taking it to the end of the chapter. Verse 35 says this, On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with him. Verse 37, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with a great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And the emphasis on this passage this morning is really on his authority. And the order moves through every type of miracle that Jesus did, demonstrating first his power over nature, which is our passage this morning that we just read. And then it goes on in chapter 5 to the power over the forces of darkness. And then the end of chapter 5 gets into his power over illness and his power even over death. And so this morning, as we go through this last part of Mark chapter 4, this action that takes place around the Sea of Galilee, the key question here that he asks, well, not Jesus himself, but the disciples ask is, who is this? From our verse 41. But yet the end result still will again be rejection as we get into chapter 6, and just as it was as we saw in chapter 3, and we'll see again. So a few will hear, as we read from verses 9 and 23 from last week, but most will hear, yet will still be unable to perceive for at least a time, and that's verse 12 that we read last week. So although Bible-believing Christians trust that Jesus performed his miracles and his ministry and through his apostles in the early church, I think many of us have a really hard time in believing in such miracles today. And that's what I was hinting at in the introduction. But God is the same no matter yesterday, today, and forevermore. He is still Lord over all creation. What he did in our past, he can do again. And it's important that we bridge this gap of faith as we look in this passage today and answer the question, what does this mean for me today? And I'm sure there's some of you even this morning that could even share a brief testimony. And I've heard some of your testimonies that how you have experienced God's miraculous power in your life. And if I had asked you again this morning, I'm sure you could give one. And certainly if you're online with us this morning, go ahead and feel free to share God's power in the comment section below. But as we continue on, we first look at his example. When Jesus finished speaking the parables in chapter 4, the disciples, they pull up anchor and they set sail. And Jesus' ministry decisions, as they change here, were never without purpose. Jesus was crossing the sea in order to enter a new area of ministry, and even a ministry with his disciples. And that's why he says to them, and he says, on that day when it was evening, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Jesus knew what was going to happen as they crossed over to the other side. And I think it's pretty evident here, at some point in our walk, in my walk with Jesus, Jesus calls me to cross over to the other side, knowing what's going to happen. And so passing over to the other side can usually mean to cross some kind of obstacle in our life, some kind of situation that we don't desire, that we don't want to do, yet he calls us. And so it begs the question, what is your obstacle? What is this storm that you're facing and that you know God's called you through? And what's hindering you then from getting to the other side where you can continue the hard work of ministry? So here are some spiritual principles that we can see in our passage this morning, at least 4 of them that I want to give to you as we pass on to the other side. First is the command to get into the boat. He tells them to get into the boat, and they obey, essentially. And at the end of this passage, the disciples say that the wind and the seas obey him. Some people sometimes aren't as smart as other people. And these disciples here, they obey him, but they get the idea that even the winds and the seas obey him by the end of this. And so Jesus says, let's pass over to the other side. And it's as if we are to wait for the Spirit's calling. And in this case, it was Jesus' calling. And the disciples had a free choice. They had a free will here. You can see that he says, let us. They could have denied him and walked away at that point. And perhaps they would have if they realized the storm they were getting into. And so I think sometimes as these storms catch us in our life by surprise, that's very purposeful. God only gives us enough that we can handle, and he equips us for what's coming next. The second thing we see from this is we must remember the promise of Jesus. Whatever God's called you to, he will bring it to fulfillment. And right here in this passage, even though the disciples didn't know this yet, the disciples couldn't have drowned. It wasn't an option. They were called by Jesus to follow him even to the cross and beyond. And so Jesus kept them, and he fulfilled his promise to him. And third, what we see in here is that we are to rest in the presence of Jesus. Verse 36, continuing on, leaving the crowd, they took him along, and he was in the boat. And the other boats were with him. And we must remember, when we face our storms, we can cling to Jesus. But we also see, like in this passage, others might be with us as well. And so whether we cling to Jesus or cling to fear, it affects those around us. And the more we cling to Jesus, the more others will trust Jesus. The less, the more fearful even others become. In the Sea of Galilee, in this context, it was a basin. Cold winds would come down from the mountains and hit the hot air rising from the water. And it's not unusual even today for sudden storms to occur, where even weather forecasts don't predict it. But I want you to see here that they were not in the storm because they had disobeyed or did something wrong. In fact, they were in this storm because they obeyed Jesus. And sometimes that's a bitter pill to swallow. We have storms not because we did something wrong, it's because we're doing something right. And it is a passage like this really destroys the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel out there that promises that if you obey, Jesus is going to bless you with no pain, no struggles, if you just have more faith, every problem is going to be erased from your life. Well, no, this passage proves that. Going on to verse 37 here, and a great storm wind developed, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already being filled with water. It was nearly sinking. And high hills had encompassed the lake on either side, and they often funneled these high winds on the water and creating these waves of 8 to 10 feet. So no, there wasn't a hole in the boat, but the water was getting into the boat, and it was literally sinking at this point with the water coming in. And actually, the Sea of Galilee, you might know this, is 700 feet below sea level. And so with the high winds in a deep lake, a large amount of water can be stirred up immediately. And so the waves breaking over the deck, they begin to fill the boat. And they're afraid. They will sink if nothing happens. And in top of this, Jesus was sleeping. He's sleeping on a cushion. Some translations, he's sleeping on a pillow. Why was he sleeping? Why in this time that they are seeing imminent death and the boat is being sunk, is Jesus sleeping? Would it be a comfort to you if you knew in your worst moment Jesus is sleeping comfortably? Why? Well, first off, Jesus is at perfect peace. There's no panic with him. There's never a panic in heaven. God, whether God the Son or God the Father, he doesn't worry about how to solve our problems. It's not a concern for him in the sense that he has to think it through and he has to figure it out, and he needs to muster up a lot of effort. And God is not in heaven wondering, how did Pastor Josh get into the mess that he's in? What am I going to do about it? No. He doesn't think, how am I going to get Josh out of this mess? No, he's at perfect peace because he knows exactly what I'm going to endure. He knows exactly what he's going to do and exactly what he wants accomplished in me. There's no mystery. Jesus knew the end of the story, the end of the situation. He could sleep. And some scholars, when they come to this passage, they see a possible connection, and it's true, there's likely a connection with the story of Jonah. If you go to the Old Testament and look at the prophet Jonah, he was in a boat on the sea. A huge storm comes, and everybody's terrified on the boat except for Jonah. In verse 5 of chapter 1 of Jonah, he's asleep in the deck below. Obviously, Jesus is greater than Jonah. Even the Gospel of Matthew talks about that in chapter 12. He reverses the negative aspects of this Jonah story. But most likely here, what's going on is that the thrust is Jesus and his great trust in God, which enables him to even sleep on a sinking boat. That is faith. So they come to him and they say, "Teacher, is it not a concern to you that we are perishing? Do you even care that we're going to drown?" Well, it's interesting. I think this is a kind of a yes and no. Yes, of course, he has a concern for us, that he loves us and he wants this relationship with us. But no, he's not concerned of situational problems, no matter how terrifying they are to us. Certainly, he wants to deliver us, and that's what we see here. But he's not concerned about it, like worried. And so the disciples here, they interpret his sleep not as faith and trust in the Father, but rather as indifference to their emergency, which is pretty easy. I think any one of us, me included, would be in this situation. Jesus, wake up! But every aspect of their response to sleeping Jesus shows that they have a lack of faith. And especially as you contrast it to Jesus' faith in his Father. And with their panic in the face of danger, and ironically, they, not Jesus, they were the fishermen who had experienced some of these storms before. And in our passage, they call him teacher. In Matthew, that's rabbi, teacher. In Matthew, they call him Lord. And then in the Luke passage, they actually call him master. But they accuse him of failing to care about this apparent imminent demise. And going back to the Jonah story in verse 6, the captain awakes Jonah and asks this prophet of God to pray for their situation. And certainly this could have been what the disciples should have said, is Jesus, pray to the Father. But they didn't. And so last thing here, before we move on to the next verse I want to see is Jesus' faith in contrast to the disciples. They were tired from the weight of the day. And Jesus was even more tired, as he was the center of attention all day long, every day. These crowds never gave him rest. And he knew intimately what tomorrow was going to bring. And so he has this in the palm of his hand, and he's tired, and he does care, but he's at peace. There's no worry. And what an example to us. Life is hard. And as a pastor, I hear the difficulties in other people's life. And as a pastor, I have my own difficulties and my own struggles as I go through life. And sometimes I think to myself, it's kind of pointless for me to tell you about my struggles. Why is it pointless? Because we all have them. Why should I bog you down with more struggles when you yourself? Well, one reason I should is God calls us to in his word. That we bear one another burdens. So yes, it is biblical, and I should, but I tend to think sometimes that it's pointless. Why? Because you guys have problems of your own, and I want to help you, and I get more fulfillment not worrying about my problems, but helping you in your problems. And so as Jesus knew what was about to occur, we should trust and have enough faith that he has it taken care of. And so we don't have to run around like chickens with our heads cut off. We don't have to fret. We don't have to be scared. It's a choice we make to be scared in our situations. Well, Josh, you don't know what I'm facing. It is a scary situation. You wouldn't want to be in it either. Yeah, you're probably right. But I do know this. God hasn't lost control, and he won't. And so that is faith. So we see his example of faith. We see him asleep on the cushion, and actually it was God's way as he was asleep on his pillow of saying, it's okay, you can sleep while I stay awake and watch out for you. The disciples had witnessed many miracles at this point, but despite that, they still panicked. And in addition, they're revealing that they completely misunderstood who their teacher really was. And up to this point in the book of Mark, they had seen Jesus perform these great miracles of compassion, teach parables that were only like spiritual truths for only those who were enlightened. But even so, they dared to ask Jesus if he even cared about them. What a slap in the face. Yes, I understand their situation. Yes, it looked like death was coming up. But to ask Jesus, do you even care about us after what he's done? Their question was really rude. And I think their misunderstanding was deep, which caused that rudeness. But how does Jesus respond? Abruptly awakened from a deep sleep, and he arises, and without even speaking to the disciples and answering their dumb question, he instead spoke to the elements. And we see some encouragement in this, and this is where I want to park for a moment in verse 39. The moment that these words came out of their mouths, their panic, Jesus gets up and he helps them. Even if their trust was misplaced, even if their question was offensive, he's there. It's a good encouragement to us. How? When we need help, no matter where we are, no matter where we find ourselves, we only need to speak his name and he hears us. And sometimes he doesn't answer us immediately. But as in this passage shows, he answers the situation. And so we must rely on the power of Jesus. And that's what we see in verse 39. It says, and he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, be quiet, be silent. And the winds abated and there was a great calm. Jesus rebukes the storm. In some translations, it's peace, be still. And these Greek words are in the imperative mood, that's a command. My translation, loose translation, could be, he's almost saying, sit down and shut up, winds. And the disciples, they were absolutely shocked at the power of their teacher to speak and control the waves. But they shouldn't have been so surprised. This is the same language that's used to rebuke and silence the demons that we saw from chapter 1, verse 25. And many see this as really an exorcism of demonic powers in the storm. Now, I don't know, that's a little bit of conjecture there. But it is possible as you consider the same language being used in chapter 1 and then even going into chapter 5 in the following story. But most likely, Jesus is addressing the wind as a living entity to demonstrate his complete control over all forces. What would you do if you saw this? If you were there on the boat and this occurred, this storm was out of their control. Their own fears were out of their control. But Jesus was never out of control. He has the authority and power over all forces. And he listens to the appeals of those who love him. Do you get this? His authority over all elements and how he ruled over all situations. And he just speaks. Nothing more here and nothing less. And as before, the world obeys as he speaks. And here, causing the wind and the waves to cease is proof of his deity. If we were to look back at Psalms chapter 65, Psalm 65 says this, by awesome deeds in righteousness, you will answer us, O God, of our salvation. And you who are the confidence of all the ends of the earth and of the far off seas, in verse 6, who established the mountains by his strength, the one who is girded with might, who stills the roar of the seas, the roar of their waves, and the commotion of the peoples. This is something that Yahweh, God the Father, Jehovah, had power to do. But his son, Jesus, in our passage, having the same power, proved himself God. Again, using another psalm, Psalm 89 this time, says, you are ruling the surging of the sea. When its waves rise, you yourself still them. And I want you to notice in our passage here how Jesus spoke only after he was spoken to in verse 38. Had the disciples not cried out to Jesus, what if he remained asleep? Not because he was unaware of their needs, but perhaps he is waiting to hear from them. God waits to hear from you now. Psalm 107 again, verse 29. He made the storm be still, and their waves became calm. And I want you to notice, too, that God didn't keep the waves from striking the boat and coming onto the boat to a point where it started sinking. But he did keep the boat from sinking entirely. We will face storms in our life. The waves will indeed scare us. It will shake us. And even perhaps it could hurt us. We'll face these storms in two ways, either with fear or with faith, or many times a little bit of both. But there's a problem with fear. And human experience speaks to that. According to one study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry before COVID, about 18.1% of people aged 18 and over suffer from some anxiety disorder. Now, they break up anxiety disorders a little bit, but in any given year, and this is before COVID again, 18.1% of adults suffer from anxiety. And I wonder what the increase is for today. Max Lucado, I think most of you are familiar with Max Lucado. In his book, Fearless, Lucado identifies one of the consequences of fear as the need to be in control. And that really defines anxiety, the want and the need to be in control. And he says in there that when we feel like we are losing control, he calls it the tyrant within us is released as we seek control at all costs. And then Lucado, in his book, he illustrates this reality through an experience that Martin Niemöller, this German professor, and he was a pastor who courageously took a stand against Adolf Hitler. And Niemöller, he first met Adolf Hitler in 1933. And later he shares with his wife what he had learned from the experience. And this is what Niemöller says of Hitler. He says, I discovered that Herr Hitler is a terribly frightened man. Fear and the related need to be in control, this response to that fear, Max Lucado concludes, releases the tyrant within us. And certainly would cause us to do rude things like question if Jesus even cares about us. But God encourages. These disciples were tough men. They were fishermen. And yet when they were put in this life-threatening situation beyond their control, their faith had quickly turned into fear. And so instead of putting them down as we continue on, Jesus simply just says, do you not have faith? And we'll see as we go on in this passage here that the answer is, well, yes, no. Certainly they had faith in Jesus. They truly believed in his miracles that he was doing. They were believing in his words, but their faith, though real, was not developed. It wasn't full grown. And so the question then becomes, how do you get faith that enables you to survive these kinds of storms, these life-threatening storms? And that brings us to our third point then this morning. Learn from his exhortation. The disciples are faithless because they are focused entirely on the earthly dilemma and they lack faith in God. And here in God the Son, Jesus. Fear is certainly the sign of a lack of faith. And so that's why Jesus asks this. He said to them, why are you fearful? Do you not yet have faith? And it's as if Jesus himself had said to the disciples, haven't you learned anything from me yet? You've been following me. And sometimes it takes years before some of us learn to depend on him, and especially depend on him totally. So why do we keep choosing fear in our situations over faith? Every one of us are either coming out of a storm or heading for a storm or waiting for one to come by. But this storm is coming. So what are we going to choose? Well, the disciples answer in verse 41 when they are terribly frightened. What are they scared about? The storm? No, it calmed. They are frightened of Jesus. They are frightened of his power. And they began to say, who then is this? Who is Jesus? They were awestruck. And we could learn something from this kind of amazing wonderment. Who is this? This is that question that every one of us have to answer. And the apostles respond with an appropriate great fear. They were terribly frightened of Jesus. And if you can imagine this for a moment, they are scared for their lives. They are scared of this storm. Then something bigger comes along. Jesus stops the storm. Hooray! No, they're scared. They went from frightened about the storm to terribly frightened about Jesus. And I think that's an appropriate response to have here. When we understand who Jesus is and his power, it is frightening. It's not the same kind of fear we have over our situations. No. It's not the same fear we have over Satan. No. This is a greater power. And there's a very high view of Christ or Christology that we can get from this in their affirmation. The Old Testament Yahweh, God the Father alone, commands the storms. We read about this already in the Psalms. Who is this is their key question. As we sing, Christ Jesus, it is he, this mighty fortress. Colossians chapter 3 puts it this way. It says in verse 16, and everything, whatever you do in word or in deed, giving thanks for all things in the name of the Lord Jesus to God the Father through him, through Jesus. Faith is truly the antidote to fear. And human experience can speak on this. Have you ever watched this loving parent teach a toddler to swim? Often a parent will stand in the water inviting this toddler to jump into him so he can catch him. or she, if it's the mom. This child stands at the edge of the pool, knowing that this child knows he or she can't swim. And this pool is frightening to this child. But the toddler has learned over time that the parents' love can be trusted. And so usually, and I see this at the YMCA when I'm there, in a moment of faith, the child leaps into the water, confident of being safe because of their parents' love for them. And at that point, this whole new world has opened up to this child. What was that antidote for that fear? It was faith in the love of their parents. So we need to have faith in the love of our Father, God the Father. But we do not learn that God's love can be trusted until we take obedient steps of faith through the storms. I think it's common for us to pray for deliverance from the storm. But really, we should be praying for endurance through this storm with faith. So we get to the end of the sermon and we say, so what? Faith, rather than fear, is required in our serious situations. And God doesn't tempt us. He does lead us through it, but he doesn't tempt anyone. We know this from James chapter 1. But a loving father must send discipline, or trials, if you will, into the lives of his children. Hebrews chapter 12. And trials provide the soil in which faith grows. And if God gives us everything we wanted, we would very soon be trusting in ourselves and the things we have rather than God. And many times that does happen. And so it's trials that force us to turn to God, to depend on him, and to forsake everything else that we have. And I think the opposite of trust is fear and worry, an earth-centric reaction to our troubles. We got to go here and find this one person. We got to find this one thing to deliver us. We need help. We get scared because we realize everything around us can't help, but God can. And so when we pray, and we pray in faith, we overcome our troubled hearts. When we go through that, we look around and we don't know how anyone could face storms and trials and troubles without Christ. I don't see much hope in our country apart from Christ. We have no other hope other than Jesus. And so, in the end, the disciples were they were filled with awe, and it's this reverent awe in Jesus to the point of being terrified. It's because suddenly they'd never seen before what they saw in that moment. Nature, the wind and the waves, even are submissive to Jesus. And they've been given this fresh revelation of the goodness and greatness of God. And he was certainly with them in the storm, whether he was sleeping or he was rebuking. He was in that boat with them. So the question for us this morning is, who is Jesus to us? Who is this? How you answer that question depends on everything in life and how you view everything, with a temporal perspective or with an eternal perspective. He is more than a teacher. He is more than a mentor, a leader. He's more than a friend. He's more than a healer. He is God. These disciples didn't ask for the storm, and they certainly didn't enjoy the storm, and they probably would have ran away from the storm if they knew it was coming. And through the storm, they didn't feel close to Jesus. But this storm did challenge them to their very core. They were afraid of the storm and became afraid of Jesus. And so they came out of that storm with this fresh understanding of God and a greater confidence and trust in him than they ever had before. So fear not. Keep believing. And the master of the sea is with you. What a Christ. Even the wind and the waves obey him. So in conclusion, trust that the Lord is with you and he does care for you. He is fighting for you when you don't even see it and know it. He's your Redeemer. He's my Redeemer. I am his child. You can be his child. Holy and dearly loved and worth dying for. And so know that Jesus is with you. If you truly believe in the Christ, he will never leave you. So 2020 did not shock Jesus with the coronavirus. 2021 is not a mystery on what he's going to do. And so everything we experience, our struggles, our hardships are not too much for him. Will you trust that all is well and we can sleep peacefully tonight knowing that he is with us? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this passage. I thank you for what it means to me, what it means to us here, what it means to us now. Lord, we do get scared. Sometimes we look at our situation and we lose faith. Lord, we come to wake you now, to rise up, to give us unshakable faith that we would leave here this morning even, trusting in you deeper. No matter what we are going through this morning, today, tomorrow, you are with us. Lord, I pray if there's anyone here this morning or who might be listening online who is scared. They don't know you. They haven't trusted you. Today would be the day of salvation for them. Lord, we know it's not too late, but one day it will be. So I pray that these people would be awakened to your power. And that you would make them new creatures. Sleep peacefully tonight. Maybe for the very first time.